It is very common to hear in today's world that someone or something is under investigation. You know what happens when there's an investigation. Everything is placed under the microscope. People look at things from every angle. They want to see what's going on, and they ask the hard questions. For a few minutes today, we're going to investigate idols. You may be saying, investigate idols? That sure sounds encouraging. Well, it really wasn't my idea. The psalmist of Psalm 135 was the original investigator of this investigation on idols. Psalm 135 begins the final section of the book of Psalms, and that final section is all about the praise and the adoration of Yahweh. And in Psalm 135, here's what the psalmist says about idols. This is coming from Psalm 135, verses 15 through 18. The psalmist says, "The idols of the nations are silver and gold, made by the hands of men. They have mouths, but they cannot speak. They have eyes, but they cannot see. They have ears, but they cannot hear, nor is there breath in their mouths. Those who make them will be like them, and so will all who trust in them." I want to take just a few moments to see what the psalmist reminds us about idols specifically and what they can't do. The first thing he says is that idols cannot speak. And if an idol cannot speak, that means that an idol can't teach. I want you to remember back to the story of Moses climbing Mount Sinai when he goes to receive the 10 Commandments from God. There's actually several different climbings that Moses performs of Mount Sinai. We know of at least 2 from the text, but some people speculate there could have been as many as 7. And it begins in Exodus chapter 20. In Exodus chapter 20, Moses climbs Mount Sinai, and God speaks to Moses the 10 Commandments. And then later on, in Exodus chapter 31, Moses will climb Mount Sinai again, where he will receive the actual 10 Commandments in the 2 tablets. But in Exodus 32, following the climb of Exodus 31, that's where we have the debacle where Moses is gone for so long, Israel doesn't think he'll ever come back, and so Israel, along with Aaron's permission, they begin dancing and worshiping a golden calf. But I want to call your attention back to Exodus chapter 20, the first climb which Moses performs on Mount Sinai, because God tells Moses after their conversation, "See that I have spoken to you. I have spoken to the nation of Israel." Our God speaks to His people. Sometimes He speaks to us through His Word. Sometimes He speaks to us through the beauty of creation. He may even speak to us through the counsel of a really good friend. But our God speaks. Idols can't do that because idols can't speak. Our God does, and our God can. Secondly, Moses says in that passage that idols, they can't see, which means if idols can't see, they can't guide us. They can't show us where to go. And how we so often depend on the wrong sources for guidance. Do you remember the story of the rich young ruler in the Gospel of Matthew? This man walks up to Jesus and says, "Good teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life?" And Jesus says, "Well, you need to obey all the commandments," and he begins to list them. And this rich young ruler says, "Check, check, check. I've done all these things." Jesus says, "Well, there's one more thing you need to do. You need to sell all your possessions, you need to give the money to the poor, and you need to come and follow me." The man doesn't do it. He walks away because his idol was wealth. Now let me ask you the question, do you think this rich young ruler could see the destruction of the choice he was making? Do you think he could see how much he was giving up by not following Jesus? No. The idol had blinded him. It had made him just like the idol. He could not see. Judas is the same story. The religious leaders contact Judas and they say, "If you will betray Jesus, we will pay you some money." 30 pieces of silver, which really wasn't much money, especially to betray the Son of God. Judas brokers the deal. In that moment when he brokers the deal, do you think he could see the terrible choice he was making? No. He was blind. But our God can see. Our God guides. He sees every angle. He sees every trap. He sees every route. And He guides us in the way of the everlasting. But the third thing that the psalmist mentions, he says they can't speak, they can't see, and then the last one he says they can't hear. And if someone can't hear, that means they can't help you when you have a problem. When we think about deaf idols, I can't help but think about the story of Elijah and the prophets of Baal in 1 Kings chapter 18 on Mount Carmel. You're probably familiar with that story. It's a showdown between the prophets of Baal and Elijah to see whose God was most powerful. They're on the mountain, and the test is very simple. Who can make fire come from the altar? Elijah defers the coin toss. He allows the prophets of Baal to go first. They dance, they scream, they cry out all day long. Nothing. About noon, Elijah even begins to taunt them. Why don't you shout a little bit louder? Maybe your God's traveling. Maybe He's asleep. See if you can wake Him up. They begin to cut themselves with stones. They begin to bleed, as was their custom. They dance and they cry all day long, and nothing. And the truth is, they could continue to dance and scream and cry and sacrifice their children and cut their flesh, but it wasn't going to do any good because their idols could not hear them. And then Elijah, upon first try, after the prophets of Baal drench his altar in water, immediately flames burn on the mountain because God heard Elijah. There's this desire in all of us as human beings where we want to feel heard. One of the most powerful images in American history is that image on 9/11, following the attacks of 9/11, when President George W. Bush is standing on the rubble there at Ground Zero, and the crowds are shouting about America and how strong America is. And George W. Bush famously says, "I hear you. The world hears you. And one day, the people who knock down these towers, they're going to hear us very soon." We all want to be heard. Any problems we have in our relationships usually stems from a problem that someone in that relationship doesn't feel heard. When there's conflict in churches, it's because someone doesn't feel heard. We want to be heard. And God hears each and every one of us. Now, truth be told, times have changed a little bit since the days of the psalmists in Psalm 135. Their idols were made by human hands out of gold and silver and other precious metals, sometimes wood. But today, anything that we give more importance to than God becomes our idol. The great reformer John Calvin once said that the human mind is a factory of idols. We were created to worship something. And if we don't worship God, we're going to replace God with something else. I don't know where you're living today watching this video. I live in North Dallas, and for a lot of people in North Dallas, an idol becomes money. It becomes wealth. How easy to place our trust, our identity, our comfort in money. I have a good friend who's a minister, and I heard him give this illustration at a conference just a few weeks ago about his own life, that he was holding a conference somewhere on marriage, and there was a very wealthy man who had come to the conference, a member of that church who was not married. He was a self-made man, an entrepreneur. He had several homes, he had several planes. And after the conference was over, this preacher was talking to this very wealthy man. The preacher's family happened to be in town. They weren't at the conference, but they had shown up after the conference was over, and his wife was waiting for her husband, the preacher, to come on so they could go eat dinner. Their children were hungry. And this self-made millionaire asked the preacher in the middle of their conversation, "Who's that woman waiting for you to come?" He said, "That's my wife. Those are my children. That's my family. We're going to eat dinner." And this self-made man told this preacher, a man of not great means, He said, "You are more wealthy than I will ever be." Money is the wrong source for comfort. Money becomes an idol. Just consider these truths. Money buys a house. Money does not provide a home. Money plans a wedding. Money does not make a marriage. Money might even support a missionary. Money does not define a mission. Money is the result of a job, but money does not build your purpose. Jesus said you can't have two masters. You cannot love both God and money. You will either hate the one and love the other, or you will be devoted to one and despise the other. Now the psalmist does say in those verses that the idols can do one thing. We become like the god or the gods that we serve. In fact, I want you to listen to that last verse very carefully as we finish today. This is verse 18. The psalmist says, "Those who make them will be like them, and so will all who trust in them." If we worship our idols, we will become just like those idols. We will become people who can't speak, people who can't see, people who can't hear. But if we serve God, if we follow Jesus, we can have it all. For He is the God who speaks, the God who sees, the God who hears. May God bless you.